Buyer confirmation sat in my inbox for 45 minutes before I opened it. I kept clicking on other things, refreshing my phone, pouring a glass of water I didn't drink. The subject line said, "Transaction complete. Settlement transfer confirmed," and the amount was right there in the preview, partially visible, and I already knew what it said because I had negotiated it for 8 months. But knowing something and seeing it finalized are two completely different experiences. $7,200,000. I had to sit down on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, the floor, with my back against the cabinet and my knees pulled up and the phone screen going dark because I forgot to tap it. I just sat there in my apartment in Kitchener, listening to the street noise outside, thinking about the 17-year-old version of me who used to babysit every weekend to save up for textbooks. Thinking about the girl who ate instant oatmeal for dinner 4 nights a week during her first year at Waterloo because tuition had cleaned her out completely. I was 31 years old. I had just settled a patent dispute over a soil monitoring technology I had spent 6 years developing, and the licensing agreement that came out of the other side of that settlement was going to pay me quarterly for the next decade on top of the lump sum sitting in my account right now. The very first thing I wanted to do was call my mother. I want you to hold on to that, because that instinct, that immediate reflex to reach for the people who are supposed to be your people, tells you everything about who I was before that afternoon, and everything about what the next 3 weeks were going to teach me. My husband, Theo, had been watching me from the doorway for about 2 minutes before I noticed him. He works from home on Tuesdays. He had a mug of coffee in his hand, and that particular look on his face, that means he's already thought through something several steps ahead of where I am. He sat down on the floor beside me. He didn't say congratulations. He looked at the screen I was holding up for him, read the number, and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't tell them yet." I stared at him. "I need you to trust me on this," he said. "Call your mother. Call your brother. But tell them the settlement fell apart. Tell them the other party countersued, and your lawyer says you're looking at years of litigation and you had to surrender the interim licensing income to cover legal fees." Theo. Teen. "One conversation," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Just let me see what comes out of it before you change their lives." I had known Theo since I was 24. He was the one who sat up with me until 2 in the morning when I was filing my first provisional patent, helping me format the technical drawings because my hands were too shaky from exhaustion to hold them straight. He had never once given me bad advice in 7 years. Not once. So I called my mother on speaker while he sat next to me and listened. She picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. She normally let it go to voicemail and called back in her own time. I told her the settlement had collapsed. I kept my voice flat and steady the way you do when you've rehearsed something. I told her the other company's legal team had filed a countermotion and my lawyer was saying it could drag on for another 2 to 3 years, and in the meantime, everything was frozen. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "Well, that's what happens when you get greedy and push for more than you're owed." I had asked for exactly what I was owed. I had documentation going back 6 years to prove it, but I didn't say that. She asked whether my name was still the primary on the joint credit account she and I had opened 4 years ago to help her manage some medical expenses that turned out to be less urgent than originally described. She wanted to know if my financial situation would affect her credit rating. That was her first question. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What do you need?" Not, "We'll get through this together the way families are supposed to get through things." Her first question was about her credit rating. Theo reached over and put his hand on mine. I told her I'd have to look into it and I'd call her back. I hung up. I looked at my husband, and he looked at me with the particular expression of a person who has just watched someone receive confirmation of something they had privately suspected for a very long time. My brother called 20 minutes later. I didn't pick up. He left a voicemail. I still have it. He said, "Heard you blew up the settlement. Kinda saw that coming. Listen, I still need that answer about the thing we discussed at Christmas. Sooner rather than later would be good." The thing we discussed at Christmas was a $22,000 loan he'd asked me for to cover a shortfall on his contracting business. I had told him I needed to think about it. He had been following up in various indirect ways ever since, and apparently news of my financial ruin was not going to slow that down. I sat with those 2 phone calls for the rest of the afternoon. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my bank's online portal and I went back through every transfer I had made to family members since I turned 25. Not because I was angry, not yet, but because I needed to understand exactly what I had been participating in. It took me 2 evenings to go through everything carefully. The number I landed on was $94,000 over 6 years. I want to say that again because I had to say it out loud to Theo twice before it stopped sounding like a mistake. $94,000. Transferred, gifted, loaned, advanced, spotted, and in most cases never discussed again, to 2 people who between them had stable pensions, owned property, and had never once in 6 years asked how my patent filings were going unless they needed something. There was the $28,000 I had given my mother over 3 separate occasions for what she described as urgent home repair situations. The furnace, the roof, a plumbing emergency that she said was going to require immediate remediation, or she'd have to leave the house. I found out about the roof money specifically because Theo had asked, a few months after I sent it, whether she'd managed to get the work done before winter. She had told him the contractor had rescheduled until spring. Then spring had come, and there was a new emergency that had nothing to do with roofing. There was $31,000 to my brother over 4 loans, none of which had a repayment schedule attached to them, because every time I tried to discuss terms, he said I was making things weird and treating him like a stranger. There was $18,000 for my sister-in-law's wellness retreat business, which my mother had asked me to invest in as a gesture of family solidarity. The business lasted 11 months. When it folded, my sister-in-law told me I should have done more due diligence before putting money in. And then there were the small amounts, the A-transfers, the just-until payday requests, the can you cover this month that became a standing arrangement no one ever formally acknowledged. I had been functioning as a private subsidy program for my family for the better part of a decade. I had told myself it was generosity. Looking at the spreadsheet Theo helped me build over those 2 evenings, I started to understand that they had not been thinking of it as generosity at all. They had been thinking of it as access, as their portion of something they had already factored into their plans. On day 4, after the fake bad news, I drove to my mother's house in Cambridge. I wore an old fleece I'd had since university, and I left my car around the corner and walked to the door. I needed to see what the air felt like in there now that the money was supposedly gone. My brother's truck was in the driveway. He hadn't mentioned he was visiting. Inside, the house smelled like good coffee and something baking, which was not typical for a Thursday afternoon. My mother had clearly been entertaining. There were 2 wine glasses on the counter, both used. She offered me tea and pushed a plate of crackers and some leftover cheese toward me with the slightly martyred energy of someone performing scarcity for an audience. My brother was on the back deck. When he came inside, he looked at me the way you look at someone who has become inconvenient. Not unkind, exactly. Just recalibrated. He sat down across from me and said very casually that he had been thinking about the family property situation. My mother owned a small parcel of land outside of town, about 11 acres, that our grandfather had left her. My brother said that given my current circumstances, and the fact that I clearly wasn't in a position to contribute the way I had been, it might make sense for me to formally relinquish any informal claim I might have to that land in the future, just so the family understood where things stood. He had brought paperwork, a letter of intent drafted by someone he knew, not a lawyer, just worded to look like one. He slid it across the table like he was doing me a favor. I looked at it. I looked at my mother, who was studying the label on the tea tin with enormous concentration. I said I would need to take it home and review it. I took it home. I scanned it. I sent it to Theo, who forwarded it to our actual lawyer, a woman named, well, I'll call her our lawyer, who described the document as not legally binding in its current form but notable for what it was attempting to accomplish. It was trying to establish, in writing, that I had no expectation of inheritance from the family property, while I was supposedly broke. While I was supposedly unable to protect my own interests. Theo poured himself a glass of water, stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, and said, "Okay, now I want to show you something." He had been doing his own research during those 4 days. What he had found, with the help of a financial consultant he trusted, was something I genuinely had not known. My brother's contracting business had a lien registered against it by the CRA. Not a small one. He was behind on HST remittances going back 18 months, and there was an active collections file. The business, such as it was already in serious trouble before he ever asked me for that $22,000. He had not mentioned this. He had simply presented the request as a temporary shortfall, a cash flow issue, something any small business goes through. The consultant also found my sister-in-law's wellness business had not simply folded. It had been dissolved while owing money to 3 suppliers and a commercial landlord. The dissolution had been handled in a way that left the liability technically in limbo. My name was not on anything, but the $18,000 I had contributed was gone into that structure. We sat with all of that for a day. Then Theo suggested we finish what we had started. He called my brother and told him that I was actually in conversation with a financial recovery specialist who had been reviewing the settlement situation and had found some overlooked contractual provisions. He was deliberately vague. He used phrases like residual IP licensing triggers and deferred revenue recognition clauses, and let my brother fill in his own picture of what that might mean. He mentioned, very offhandedly, that there might be some paperwork circulating in the next week related to an asset restructuring review, and that if my brother received anything, he should read it carefully before signing, because the implications could be significant. My brother called me 4 times in the next 2 days. I let it go to voicemail every time. On the 5th day, Theo's consultant reached out to my mother. He identified himself as an independent financial mediator and told her that as part of the asset restructuring review, any family members who wanted to establish a formal claim to the settlement proceeds would need to demonstrate standing by executing a statutory declaration, confirming their financial relationship to my work and their legal interest in any associated income streams. He told her this was standard procedure. He told her it needed to happen quickly because the window for establishing standing was narrow. My mother, who had spent 30 years believing that the right signature on the right document would eventually unlock something she deserved, signed the statutory declaration the same day. What she declared under oath and with her own signature was that she had been a consistent financial supporter of my research and development work, and had a reasonable expectation of participating in any resulting commercial proceeds. This was not true. The opposite was true. I had been supporting her. But she had signed it, and Theo's consultant had the original. My brother was more cautious. He called me directly and asked what exactly he would be confirming if he signed. I told him I couldn't really discuss the specifics while it was still in review, but that the mediator had told me that standing would only be granted to people who could document a genuine supporting role in my career. I said it very neutrally. I said I assumed he'd want to be included. He signed the next morning. Theo had given our lawyer all of it by the time he called them both and asked them to come to a meeting at a neutral office space we had booked for the afternoon. He told them we were meeting to discuss the asset restructuring outcome. He did not tell them what the outcome was. My mother arrived in a blazer I had given her for her birthday 3 years ago. My brother arrived with his wife, who had dressed as though she expected to be photographed. They sat down across from Theo and me and our lawyer, and a second lawyer from the firm who specialized in fiduciary claims. My mother smiled at the second lawyer. She said she assumed they were there to discuss her portion of the settlement proceeds. She said she understood the process had taken longer than expected, but she was glad it was finally being resolved. Our lawyer placed the statutory declaration on the table. She placed beside it a letter from the CRA confirming my brother's HST collections file. She placed beside that a 12-page summary document Theo and I had prepared over the previous week, documenting every financial transfer from my accounts to family members over 6 years, with dates, amounts, receiving accounts, and where applicable, the stated reason for the transfer versus what the funds had been used for, including the roof repair that preceded a Mediterranean cruise my mother had posted about on Facebook the following month. I knew about the cruise because a colleague had mentioned seeing the photos and assuming my mother and I had gone together. The room was quiet for a long time. Our lawyer explained that by signing the statutory declaration, my mother had made a sworn statement that could be examined in the context of any legal proceeding. She explained that the statement was inconsistent with the documented financial record of the relationship between my mother and me, which showed my mother as a consistent recipient of support, not a provider of it. She explained that making a false statutory declaration in Canada is an indictable offense under the criminal code. She explained that the same applied to my brother. My sister-in-law got up and left the room without speaking. She has not spoken to me since. My brother said it had all been a misunderstanding. He said the mediator had explained things differently. He said he hadn't understood what he was signing. My mother looked at me for the first time since she'd sat down. She said, "I cannot believe you would do this to your family." I didn't argue with her. I didn't explain, not right there. I just looked at her for a moment, this woman who had answered my crisis call by asking about her credit rating. And I thought about the 17 years of birthday cards and Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings that had all existed inside the assumption that I would always be there when she needed something. And I thought about how not one of those years had included a single conversation about what I needed. I said, "The restructuring review is complete. There are no proceeds for family claimants. This meeting is over." Theo and I walked out first. My brother's contracting business folded 6 weeks later. The CRA collections file moved forward without my involvement. He and my sister-in-law sold their house in Guelph and moved into a rental. I heard about it from a cousin who had no idea any of this had happened and mentioned it as ordinary news. My mother retained a lawyer of her own, briefly, to explore whether the meeting had been conducted improperly. Her lawyer apparently reviewed the documentation and advised her that it had not been and that pursuing the matter further would not be in her interest. She dismissed that lawyer and retained another one, who came to the same conclusion after 3 weeks. I don't know what happened after that because I stopped receiving updates. The statutory declaration matter was referred to a Crown review. As of the last thing I was told by our lawyer, no charges had been pursued. But the declarations were flagged and the file remained open. 3 months after the meeting, a card arrived at my office address, which I still don't know how she found. It was a greeting card with a watercolor cardinal on the front, very Canadian, the kind you find at a pharmacy. Inside, my mother had written that she had not been well and that the stress of recent events had affected her health, and that she hoped I understood that everything she had ever done had been out of love for her children. I read it once. I put it in the recycling bin under my desk and went back to the licensing call I had been on before the mail arrived. I don't tell this story because I'm proud of the strategy or because I want anyone to feel sorry for me. I'm not proud of needing to do it, and I'm too far past those years to need sympathy. I tell it because I spent a very long time believing that proving my value to my family financially would eventually translate into them seeing me as a person, as a daughter and a sister, not as a resource. And I want to be honest about how long it took me to understand that those are two completely different things, and that no amount of money moved from my account to theirs was ever going to close that distance. There is a specific kind of grief that comes with discovering that the people who were supposed to be unconditionally in your corner were actually conditional all along. The condition was just so familiar and so old that you had stopped seeing it as a condition and started calling it family. Theo is reading across the room from me right now. He just looked up over his reading glasses to check if I wanted more tea. That's it. That's the whole gesture. 7 years, and that still feels like something I don't entirely deserve, which is probably the thing I'm still working on. The patent is doing well. The quarterly payments come through on schedule. I have a colleague now, someone 4 years younger than me, who reminds me a little of myself at 25, and I have had very deliberate conversations with her about documenting everything, protecting her work, and understanding the difference between the people who believe in you and the people who believe in what you might eventually be able to do for them. She listened very carefully. I hope she keeps that distinction with her. I hope it costs her less to learn than it cost me. The cardinal card is in the recycling. The silver watch I used to wear, the one my grandmother gave me before she passed, is on my wrist. She was the one person in that family who ever asked about my work without wanting anything from it, who sat with me in her kitchen in Hamilton when I was 9 years old and told me that the smartest thing a woman can do is build something that belongs entirely to her. I'm still building, and it's entirely mine. I keep thinking about the moment my mother signed that statutory declaration, how quickly she reached for the pen, how she didn't ask a single question first. There's something clarifying about watching someone make a choice like that. Not cruel, not satisfying exactly, just clarifying. Because what I saw in that moment wasn't a woman being tricked. It was a woman finally revealing what she had always believed, that my success was something she was entitled to collect. She had believed that for years. The only thing that changed was that she finally put it in writing. I spent a long time after everything settled trying to understand how I had let it go on for so long. $94,000 over 6 years is not a small amount. It is not something that happens to a person who isn't paying attention. It happened because I was paying a different kind of attention. I was watching for signs of approval, for the moment when my mother would finally look at me the way I needed her to, and I kept believing that the next transfer, the next yes, would be the one that did it. That's not generosity. That's something closer to negotiation, and the person on the other side of that negotiation was never actually bargaining in good faith. What Theo did, what he asked me to trust him on before I picked up the phone that afternoon, was not cruelty either. It was clarity. He understood something I was still learning, that protecting yourself from people who are willing to harm you is not the same as harming them. My mother and my brother made every choice that brought them to that meeting room. The statutory declarations were their words. The false claims were their decisions. The consequences belonged entirely to them. I think about integrity a lot differently now than I did at 25. I used to think it meant being generous even when it hurt. I thought it meant absorbing the cost of other people's choices because that's what good daughters do, what good sisters do. I understand now that real integrity requires honesty first. Honesty about what a relationship actually is, not what you wish it were. Letting someone continue to take from you because you're too afraid to name what's happening isn't kindness. It's avoidance dressed up as love. The intelligence piece took me longer, not the academic kind. I'd always been fine on that front. I mean the kind of clear-eyed thinking that Theo demonstrated when he put his hand over my phone and said, "Wait." The kind that looks at a situation and asks what is actually true here, not what I want to be true. That's harder. It requires you to sit with uncomfortable information without immediately reaching for a way to make it feel better. I had been making things feel better for years, calling loans love, calling silence peace. And then there's just the simple fact of keeping going. My colleague, the one who reminds me of myself at 25, asked me once how I had managed to keep working on the patent through everything, the filings, the disputes, the years of uncertainty. I told her I didn't have a better option. That's the honest answer. You don't always push forward because you're brave. Sometimes you push forward because you've already put too much into something to let someone else's noise be the reason you stop. The patent is mine. The settlement is mine. The quiet Tuesday mornings in Kitchener with Theo reading across the room are mine. I built all of it with no one's permission and no one's blessing. And it turns out that's the only way it could have been built at all.